Now by microwave, Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa speaks with Charles Templeton in Toronto.
We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
Under the great hammer blows of homogenizing from the United States.
But all it took to enter the United States was a New York marketing expert and a campaign to make Moosehead an exotic specialty.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Red Ensign Special. In this edition, we're going to look at the financial situation in Canada, the current Carney government's claims their assertion that they intend to make a generational investment in Canada and its quote unquote new economy. We're going to evaluate the plausibility of the federal government making a very, very large investment in order to reshape Canada's economy. I'd like to begin by hearing the Carney government in their own words, and then we'll have a look at the state of play for the government of Canada.
We're going to present a great budget in this House on the 4th of November, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be a generational investment in our future. We're going to build this country, Mr. Speaker. We're going to protect our communities. We're going to empower Canadians. We're going to build the strongest economy in the G7. We're going to build this country like never before. We're going to build the Canada of the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, we are the true north, strong and free.
All right. Well, there you have the statement from the government of Canada. There's a number of different versions, whether from Parliament or elsewhere, that you can pull that look something like that. The key details here are they're very long on rhetoric, kind of classic state capitalist rhetoric, where they suggest that the government is going to make substantial investments intended to reorient the economy. And, somehow it's going to be the economy of the 21st century, blah, blah, blah. They're very short on details. So as we come through the fall and the details of the budget become public, we'll look a little bit about the viability of the specific things that they plan to do. But the only thing that's really makes sense based on the rhetoric is that they plan to make very large state capital investments intended to reorient the axis of trade of Canada away from its dependent relationship with the United States. Now, the scale of investments that would be required in order to do so is enormous, almost unfathomable. And so I thought the logical place to start for this episode is to look at the state of Canada's finances and its ability to sustain large deficit spending in order to make the investments that the government of Canada is discussing. So, first things first, let's have a look at things as they are, and then we'll kind of look at the prospects of making investments on the back of Canada's current financial position. The government is correct that the tariffs have severely affected the balance of trade in Canada. They've caused a significant slowdown in Canada's economy. This quarter was one of the worst quarters ex of COVID for GDP growth in Canada's recent history. And so, they're not wrong that fundamental changes need to be made, but let's look at the viability of making those fundamental changes and kind of where we are as a country, putting aside their competence to make those changes until we get more details on what exactly it is they plan to do. So Canada is in an interesting position with regard to its national finances. You can see this is a long-term chart of the debt to GDP ratio for Canada's federal government. You can see by the big jump and then rapid decline after 2020 that there are interesting games being played with this this metric. One of the problems that you'll see with the discourse around the condition of Canada's finances is that Canada made such radical changes to its economic model during COVID that virtually all the traditional metrics that have been used for the last maybe even 30, 35 years to look at the state of its public finances have been disrupted. And there are strange games going on that affect them. For example, hang on. I didn't know this, but during COVID, a huge percentage of Canada's debt moved from the provincial to the federal level. Not actually sure what the precise mechanism for this was, but you all might remember that during the financial crisis in the late 80s and early 90s, the strategy of the federal government was to download responsibilities from the federal government to the provincial government in order to improve the top line state of finances, which led to the massive accumulation of debt on the balance sheet of the various provinces. During the Trudeau administration, a lot of that debt seems to have been reabsorbed at the federal level. Now, certainly not all of it. The financial condition of many of the provinces is still not particularly good, but it has changed the dynamic quite significantly compared to where we were headed prior to 2020. And if we have a look at the chart of the absolute dollars of combined federal and provincial debt, a lot of the gains that you saw in the debt to GDP metric all kind of disappear. You see a fairly steady upward trend, and you see a disruption fundamentally for 2020, 2021 associated with the COVID spending. But you don't see a situation where things have radically improved in the post-COVID era. That's just a trick of the way that GDP is measured. So with that kind of in the back of our mind, gross numbers don't really tell us about the capacity of the government to borrow. Debt to GDP, which is a traditional metric that is intended to measure this, it's kind of subject to funny games right at the moment. We've got to go a layer deeper and look at the particular financial metrics associated with the government. So this data here is a little bit old, but it looks at borrowing during the Trudeau administration. You can see that really since Trudeau was elected, the structural deficits that used to define Canada have returned. You can see the rosy projections in 2021 for the elimination of that deficit shortly thereafter. But if we go to the StatsCan report, we can see that Canada is, if you look at the last 4 quarters of spending versus expenditures, here we've got 5 quarters, we've got general revenues, we've got gross expenditures, we have actual deficits, and the last 4 running quarters, we see about 100 billion in deficit spending, and we see quite a marked acceleration in Q2 as the tariffs have started to bite the economy. So these rosy projections here were actually in 2025 about here. So we're in a worse condition than immediately after COVID from a spending point of view. And that deficit does not include any significant emergency relief, which means that it is structural. There will have to be fundamental changes to the balance sheet made in order to correct it. That means cuts in spending, or that means radical increases in revenue, neither of which seem to be in the immediate plans of the Carney government. with that in mind, we now need to look at metrics of the ability of the government to sustain its level of debt. One of the most effective metrics here to look at is the percent of revenue spent on interest payments, which is kind of a measure of the acute financial stress associated with the debt. Now, again, these projections are from a couple of years ago. There aren't elegant graphs for the most recent data, but you can see in 2020, we passed an inflection point where the acute state of Canada's finances had been improving for quite some time. And that was as a consequence of a long period of quite low interest rates, combined with the substantial reduction in gross debt load that occurred from the period of Jean Chrétien's government all the way through to the end of the Harper government. So that was where we were. And since COVID, that situation has worsened quite severely. The total debt load has radically increased. At the same time, interest rates have had to go up as a consequence of inflation. Now, those who don't follow the markets particularly closely may not be aware of exactly how this pattern has played out. In 2022, the Bank of Canada radically increased interest rates at the most aggressive pace it has done in a very, very long time. But in late 2024 and now in 2025, the Bank of Canada has begun to lower interest rates quite substantially again. This despite lingering inflation, really because of how poor the GDP growth in the country is getting. You saw the terrible quarter we passed in, which led to another cut in rates from the Bank of Canada. So that metric, the percent of spending which is associated with interest payments, because of the Bank of Canada's reduction in interest rates, that projection for radical increases in the percent of government spending associated with interest payments is not likely to come to fruition. So if we look at the hard data here, back in the third quarter of 2020, about 6% of federal spending was on interest payments. That peaked in Q3 2024 at 13.5%. It's come back down to about 12%. So the question right at the moment for the Government of Canada's ability to continue to borrow is whether the reduction in interest rates can be sustained without causing a run on the dollar. So if you recall the discussion on this channel about the financial crisis in Canada in the late 80s and early 90s, the Government of Canada got into a position where it could no longer where it could not reduce interest rates to alleviate its financial problems, because if it reduced interest rates, the dollar would continue to collapse. And it even got to the point where, for fear that Canada would devalue the dollar, foreign investors borrowed money denominated not in Canadian dollars, but denominated in US dollars. This was a key crisis point that forced the Government of Canada to change course on its financial situation and address the problem with dramatic cuts to spending. Now, if we look at the situation today, the situation looks a fair bit better with regard to the dollar. So there was a very substantial decline in the value of the dollar in the first part of the Trudeau government as a consequence of the decline in prices of oil on the international market. But the dollar has actually been relatively stable since then. There's been a decline as a consequence of the decline associated with COVID. But despite an early panic in association with the imposition of tariffs from the United States, we have not yet seen a collapse of the dollar as a consequence of declining interest rates. So we're not yet at a hyper-acute point for government spending in Canada. In fact, the Carney government is probably correct that it can sustain very large deficits for a period of time because of the relatively low prevailing interest rates and because the dollar has not yet collapsed. It has a chronic situation which is unsustainable, maybe on the 5 or 10 year time horizon, but it does not have an acute problem that needs to be addressed right now, today. So when we look at the Carney government's rhetoric, we can conclude that it's very likely that they will, in fact, turn in the very large deficits they have promised. They will, we've yet to see exactly what it is that they plan to do in order to restructure Canada's economy, but they're going to get an opportunity to do so. And how those efforts fare will play a large part in determining whether this country faces a financial crisis in the second half of the 2020s, or whether we get to kind of move along business as usual. I highly suspect that what we're really looking at here is a problem which is likely to become acute in the latter 2020s, maybe 2028, 2029, rather than a situation where the investments made by the Carney government eliminate this problem. But we'll see.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.